I'm Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing my newest fancy booktube hat, and today I am bringing you my month-late wrap-up for the month of January. This is a video that I just haven't had time to film, and I'm expecting that it'll get kind of lengthy, so I may have to take a break in the middle and come back and film the rest of this tonight after I've lost my daylight, which would be too bad. But I do really have to get this filmed today because I'm about to go out of town for about a week, and I will not be able to film wrap-ups while I am away from my books. So the first book I finished in January was one that I had been reading for months, and I am so glad that I will finally be able to return this to my mom because this is her copy that I'd had borrowed from her for like a couple years, and this is The Secret Keeper by Kate Morton. I feel really bad that I didn't get along so great with this book because this is one of my mom's favorite books. This is the second thing I've read by Kate Morton, and while there's a lot that sort of appeals to me about her work, the fusion of multiple timelines with a, historical fiction setting mixed with a bit of a family mystery. These are all things that appeal to me, but there were a lot of things about this book that just got on my nerves, and I am going to admit that part of it is probably because I am becoming more and more of an SFF reader. And this sort of general fiction operates with a different set of storytelling techniques, a number of which I kind of roll my eyes at even while I'm completely aware that I accept and I'm even happy to read similarly on-the-nose storytelling techniques that are, traditional to other genres. This is sort of like a nostalgic, schmaltzy family murder thing. It has two main timelines. We begin with a major event that's in between the two timelines during one of our protagonists, Laurel's teenage years. She witnesses her mother kill a man and sort of unwittingly helps cover it up. And so many years later, when she's a famous actress, roll eyeballs, and her mother Dorothy is on her deathbed, Laurel suddenly becomes super curious about what actually happened and why, and she starts digging into her mother's past. Now, there are a couple of things that bug me here. First, there's a sort of writing technique that Kate Morton uses all the time, like really heavy-handedly, where some, small event or object will suddenly reawaken the character's memory of something that happened decades before, but now she remembers it with such clarity and it's so meaningful and so important. And now some minor detail of that memory that she hasn't remembered for decades is suddenly this major clue in helping understand the story that she's starting to piece together, and it's like, that's not how memory works. The other thing that annoys me is this basic premise that she's suddenly curious about her mother's history just as her mother is ill and not lucid enough to actually, answer any questions about it or talk with her about it. So she goes the whole book trying to figure out the mystery. And then at the end, when she figures it out, her mother is lucid for just long enough that they have their full, mother-daughter talk about the past thing, and it feels so contrived. So that's the first plotline. And then the second plotline is of young Dolly coming of age during World War II in Britain, and I hated this plotline because Dolly is just such a despicable character on every level. She was obviously so rash and impulsive and unwise in every single decision she made, in every thought she had, that I was just nervous. I was a nervous wreck reading her chapters. And so I kept putting this book down and not wanting to pick it back up again. And that was a particularly bad way for me to read this particular book, or at least this type of book, because Kate Morton's writing depends entirely upon making you sort of believe one thing, sort of transparently making you believe one thing, because you can tell that she gives you half pictures intentionally of what's going on in various timelines. It's very transparent that she's messing with you, and I don't like being messed with like that. But she does it in order to spring sequences of surprises at you. And reading it very slowly gave me enough time to ponder what I was being told and what I wasn't being told, that I was pretty sure most of the time, if not what all of the surprises were, at least where in the story they were, because it was clear to me where the information was being omitted. And the main point of this book, like the main selling point that people talk about when they really like the book, including like in some of the blurbs on the back and stuff, is that it has like a twist ending that no one will ever see coming. You will not see the twist coming. And so of course I was sitting here reading this very slowly over a period of months thinking, what the heck is this twist? And I actually guessed it halfway through. I made note of where in the book I came up with this like wild conspiracy theory of what the end twist might be. And I was like, I bet I'm wrong. This is too wild to possibly be it. But I'll just make a mental note and wait and see what happens. And then for the entire second half of the book, I was watching Kate Morton try to convince me that I was wrong without actually giving me any contradictory evidence that would prove I was wrong. And by the end, she had gotten pretty dang close to convincing me that I had been wrong all those pages back. And then I was right, and I was so mad. Anyone reading this book, like at a regular pace, would not have time to tie their brain in knots over it like I did. And unfortunately, it sort of spoiled the whole thing for me. There is, I will point out, a third point of view storyline that's introduced late in the book that, you know, I actually really liked that character. I liked reading about that character. So that is why this book gets 2 stars from me instead of 1. But yeah, this was not such a fun time, and I feel so sad that I disliked one of my mom's oh-so-favorite books oh so much. So the next thing I read was Prime Meridian by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This is a novella that I have already reviewed, so I will link my review video where it was a double review with this novella and Autonomous by Annalee Newitz. This is a crowd-funded, self-published novella that I got an arc of via NetGalley. People who supported the crowdfunding effort got their copies in December, so that's the official publication date, but for the general public it's currently on pre-order and it will be available in July, I think. I gave this 3 stars. I was feeling really reading slumpy at the beginning of the year. It took me a long time to get through, and it's a very slow-paced story, so it wasn't necessarily what I needed to get me out of that reading slump, but it's a near-future story that's very character-centric. It's a portrait of one young woman's life in a near-future Mexico City where things are looking pretty bad for her prospects in life. I did really like the ending, and I think there's a lot that's really worthwhile in this. I only gave it 3 stars. It wasn't what I was looking to read at the time, but I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with it. I'm a little more objective in my review. That is what the review is for. You can go watch it. The next 2 books that I finished were both picks for the Into the Forest group on Goodreads. The first is Wonder Tales: 6 French Stories of Enchantment. This is edited by Marina Warner, and each of the stories has a different translator. I had actually read this before. This copy of this book was a gift I was given from one of my middle school teachers for my middle school graduation, who apparently knew me better than I knew myself at the time, because at the time I had no idea that I would ever be interested in, like, weird adult fairy tales. I remember reading this the summer before I started high school and having no idea whatsoever what to make of it, but there were bits of it that stuck with me, and it was interesting to see what I remembered and what I didn't. These stories all have a very distinctive 17th century French flavor, and the context of these stories, the cultural and literary context, is almost more interesting than the stories themselves, although the stories themselves are all totally worthwhile and very interesting to read. I would say in my fairy tale reading so far, my limited original fairy tale reading so far, this is probably my favorite, like, niche of fairy tale history. I want to read more stories like this, and I want to read more about the people who wrote these stories, because it's all just fascinating. Like, I liked the introduction to this book almost as much as any of the stories. So in 17th century France, there was a literary fairy tale movement. So this is fairy tales as written literature amongst the upper classes, as opposed to as oral tradition amongst the lower classes, that came out of the salons and therefore was driven by women. And so this use of fantasy and wonder in literature and the sort of insistence that this sort of fantasy story is worthy of literary merit it's this female tradition that's a counter-literary tradition to the classicism that we associate with this time that was espoused by the Académie Française that didn't allow women to be members. And so there's something incredibly subversive about the existence of these stories at all. And the authors of these stories, most of them are women. 5 out of the 6 of these stories are attributed to women. You can just hear how sharp and witty and smart they are in the tellings of these stories. And some of the elements of these stories hold up better today than others, but you can tell that these storytellers are like actively in conversation with various ideas and schools of thought of the time. And so they sometimes come across as a little tongue-in-cheek, is I think what I'm trying to say. But like in a very 17th century French way. Like if you spend any considerable amount of time with writing from this period, you will recognize it. So the stories in this collection are The White Cat, The Subtle Princess, Bearskin, The Counterfeit Marquise, Starlight, and The Great Green Worm. My favorite was absolutely The White Cat. All of the others were very interesting for me and had elements that really intrigued me, but none of them quite held up overall like The White Cat did. So I started out with that first story being like a 5-star story for me, thinking this might end up being a 5-star collection. Overall, I gave this book 4 stars. I didn't dislike any of the stories. I just thought that maybe some of them didn't hold up quite as well overall. The White Cat is a story with basically 2 halves that are kind of 2 complete fairy tales in and of themselves. The first is, it reads like a gender-bent Beauty and the Beast. There are 3 princes, and their father, the king, keeps sending them out on these quests in order to prove which one is worthy of the throne. And of course, the one we're concerned with is the youngest one. And each of the 3 times the father sends the sons out on these quests, the youngest prince finds himself at this like fairy castle inhabited entirely by cats. The lady of this castle is the White Cat, and she's a talking cat, but she won't explain why she's a talking cat. And each of the 3 times he's completely besotted with her and stays with her the entire year, and at the end of the year she helps him with some magic something or other to, you know, win his father's favor. And then the second half of the story, after the first half of the story is resolved and we get the happily ever after, is the backstory where the White Cat, who is of course not a white cat, tells the prince how she became enchanted, and it's basically a Rapunzel story. So it's like 2 fairy tales in one, and there's a castle full of talking cats, so obviously it's great. The Subtle Princess I had more mixed feelings about, sort of as a feminist reader of old fairy tales. When the king goes away from his country, he decides to ensure his 3 daughters' virtue by locking them up in a tower and giving them each a little trinket that will break if her virtue is compromised. So there's this really unfortunate focus on sexual purity and some kind of slut-shaming of the 2 older sisters who fail in this regard when this rakish evil prince connivingly decides to trick them all. On the other hand, I really did love how the heroine of the tale, the youngest princess, is depicted as getting herself out of all of these bad situations and achieving a happy ending through the use of her intelligence and cunning. She's a trickster herself and is rewarded for it. There is one moment, and this is a really good quote, where she confronts the prince and she's like, "Prince, if you take 1 step nearer me, I shall raise this axe and slice your head into 2 neat hemispheres." And there's an illustration. I don't really like the illustration style in this book, but this one is worth having in there. The next story is Bearskin, which is another one where the princess is transformed into the shape of an animal, this time by her fairy godmother to help her get away from marriage to an ogre. I actually recently saw that there was a Tor.com article entirely on this fairy tale, so I will link that for you and you can read more about it. The counterfeit Marquise is the outlier in this collection for a variety of reasons. First, it's the only one attributed to a man, in this case 2 men. It's thought to be a collaboration between Charles Perrault, who is of course the most famous today author of fairy tales from this period. The one man who wrote some is the one we all remember, not all of the women. A collaboration between him and Francois Timelon de Choisy. I have no idea if I'm saying that right, it's very French. But that guy was apparently an infamous cross-dresser, and this story has no actual magic in it. So the reason it's considered like a fairy tale is not because there is magic, but because it requires a considerable amount of suspension of disbelief. It also follows the sort of turbulent courtship to happily ever after structure of the other stories in this collection, but it doesn't take place like in a kingdom far away once upon a time. If you consider this in context when it was written, it would have been like a contemporary story that uses some fairy tale tropes. But it's clearly in this collection because it's fascinating. It is sort of about a transgender marquise who falls in love with a transgender marquis and they get married and live happily ever after. The main character is raised as a girl by her mother who wanted a daughter and not a son, and she's totally aghast to learn that she's a boy and can't get married to her true love. It doesn't operate with the same understanding of queer people that we have today. A story like this would never permit a happy ending between 2 partners who were not biologically of opposite genders. So it reinforces the norms in that way. And there were a lot of details that I remember thinking were important at the time that I'm forgetting now, but it is a story that sort of made me sit up and go, oh? Starlight is a story of a lost princess who doesn't know she's a princess. But the prince is obviously in love with her because she's clearly so very noble, and she has a fairy godmother who helps her out. I'm remembering like none of the details of this story. I remember that she lived with a community of centaurs for a while. I think there was also an island ruled by women where people went to war by like throwing crab apples at each other. There's clearly satire in here that's very specific to the time period, but it didn't make a huge impression on me. And then the last story in the collection is The Great Green Worm, which is a Cupid and Psyche thing that's self-consciously aware that it's a Cupid and Psyche thing. Like, it references other fairy tales, including Cupid and Psyche. In fact, a lot of these stories reference other fairy tales, some of which are familiar to me as a 21st century reader and some of which aren't. There are a few footnotes in here that are helpful. So it feels overall like a very self-aware strain of fairy tale literature. But in The Great Green Worm, there is a princess who, in a very Sleeping Beauty-esque scene, is cursed not to fall asleep, but to be incredibly, incredibly ugly. And we see how her family sort of casts her out because of this. And then she eventually meets the Great Green Worm, who's even uglier than her, but she has to save him, and they will eventually become beautiful again and live happily ever after. This was a very interesting story with a lot of layers to it, but ultimately, again, not my favorite. None of them quite lived up to The White Cat, but I loved this book as a whole, and I gave it 4 stars. Okay, guys, we're back. I had to take my break. This is where we're gonna pick back up. The next thing I read was Briar Rose by Jane Yolen. This was another one of the group picks for the Into the Forest group. This is a sort of a Sleeping Beauty retelling. It's not fantasy, though. This is a book that uses the idea of the story of Sleeping Beauty to talk about the Holocaust. This was published in 1992. It's about a 20-something-year-old a young woman named Becca. She's working at a small progressive newspaper, and her beloved grandmother passes away. She was very close with her grandmother, but realizes that she really knew nothing about her, that her grandmother never really told anyone where she came from or what her story was. She had often told Becca and her sisters a version of the Sleeping Beauty tale, and before she dies, she insists to Becca that she was the princess in the story, and she wants Becca to go find the castle and learn what happened. With only a few ambiguous documents as clues, she tracks her grandmother's story back to Poland, and eventually learns how she escaped the Holocaust. And I think if you know much about the history here, it won't be super unpredictable, but I don't think that lessens the impact of the story. Interspersed, we get portions of the version of Sleeping Beauty that her grandmother used to tell, her version of the fairy tale being sort of dark and sinister in its own unique ways that eventually illuminate what her grandmother's real story is. And it's very much about how we can use fairy tale as a means to process real-world trauma. I gave this book 4 stars. A couple quibbles I have are that Becca's 2 older sisters come across as like spoiled teenagers, even though they are grown women with families and children of their own. And that didn't make a lot of sense to me. Also, in some respects, this book, recent though it is, feels outdated just because it's all about research, and it's research in like a pre-internet era. It's definitely a reminder that information is way more accessible now than it was even when this book was published. It is a little bit of a shock to me, a child of the internet age, when Becca like literally gets on a plane to Poland with absolutely no plans of how she's going to follow the clues once she gets there, except like walking into a village and asking people on the street, hey, what happened here during the Holocaust? But this definitely is as gut-wrenching and hard to read at times as it needs to be. It would probably be the sort of book that would be a good introduction to the Holocaust for younger readers. It's marketed in some editions as YA. I don't think it really is YA. The protagonist is in her 20s, and again, heavy subject matter, but I think it is a book that could be given to younger readers for teaching purposes. After I gave this my 4-star rating, I noticed that some of the people in the Goodreads group discussion for it were pointing out some of the ways they felt that Jane Yolen had misrepresented Polish culture. And so it is disappointing to think that the author may not have done her due diligence in terms of research in that regard. But anyways, that's Briar Rose. The next book I read was The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzie Lee, which is a YA novel that has already gone back to the library, so I don't have my copy here anymore. This ended up being the book that I needed to pull me out of my reading slump, because it's very fast-paced, very easy reading, you know, fun YA. And I think my rating reflects that. I gave it a 4-star rating. If I'd read it at a time where that wasn't what I was specifically looking for, I might have only given this a 3 stars. But regardless, I'd heard so much about this book before picking it up that I sort of knew what to expect. It takes place in the 18th century, and it's about a young gentleman named Monty who is going on a grand tour with his best friend Percy and his younger sister Felicity, who's supposed to be dropped off at her finishing school part of the way into the journey. It does not go at all as planned. Monty is this very rakish and flippant character. He's very much into all of the debauchery, and he does some very dumb things that lead to basically the 3 young people being on the run from the French, facing all sorts of wild trials and tribulations. I think I would have been really frustrated with Monty as the sole point of view protagonist of this book if I hadn't been aware that Felicity is getting her own book as a sequel. I don't know if Percy will eventually get a book as well, but that would make me happy, because part of the whole conceit of the book is that Monty, as a point of view character, has a lot of growing to do in his understanding both of Percy, whom he is deeply in love with, and Felicity, his sister, whom he hasn't, you know, bothered to pay any attention to at all. Percy and Felicity are initially much more sympathetic characters than Monty. Percy is a young black man from a noble family whose position in society is sort of unclear. It turns out that he has epilepsy, and that's also a huge part of his story concerning the attitudes towards epilepsy in this time period. Felicity is a really brilliant, academically minded person, but also way more practically capable than Monty wants to give her credit for. Monty is bisexual, and he's created this very promiscuous persona for himself, but he has real trouble trying to deal with his real feelings for Percy that he assumes are unrequited. Of course they're not. And he keeps like messing up that relationship like big time because he like doesn't know how to be a good person in that relationship for Percy. But as I was saying, Monty's sort of glib narration does kind of move the story along in a kind of upbeat tone and still allows for those really character-driven moments of growth. There is more to Monty than meets the eye. We know that he is in bad trouble with his very disapproving father, who is demanding that he clean up his act and come back and learn how to run the estate, dang it. And it's like, oh, poor Monty, you have to learn how to be a very rich boy and have an estate. Poor you. Except that it turns out that his father is really abusive, and that's really not a good situation for Monty to be in at all. In terms of the big adventure plot, there is some alchemy involved, and so there is kind of this fantasy element, but it's very minor. There were also a couple of side characters that I thought were underutilized and contributed to the sort of YA novel trope of like, why is everyone in this a teenager? Anyways, it was a fun enough romp to get me out of my reading slump, which is what I needed it to be right then, and I gave it 4 stars. The next thing I read was the first of 2 graphic novels that I've already discussed in a couple of videos already, so this should be quick. This is Castle in the Stars, The Space Race of 1869 by Alex Alice. This is the first in a steampunk middle grade-ish series that has lovely, lovely art. The lovely, lovely art is why I am reading this, but the story is also fun. I've mentioned before, it reminds me a little bit of the kind of high-stakes intrigue steampunk alt history of the Leviathan trilogy by Scott Westerfeld, with this trio of young people who end up being in the middle of alt historical shenanigans. The main character is this boy named Seraphin, whose mother disappeared on a balloon mission to try to prove the existence of ether. It turns out that his mother's logbook is eventually recovered, and those who found it use it to bring his father and himself out to a castle in Bavaria where his father is enlisted to help design an ether ship. And Seraphin meets and befriends these 2 other kids who live there, and they get involved in some stuff. I will admit from the cover, I sort of thought that this volume would have some space adventure in it. This took place entirely on Earth. The ether ship was launched at the end of this book, so hopefully future volumes will involve actual, you know, steampunk space adventure. This one was mostly involved with the intrigue and peril of these historical characters in this alt-historical circumstance dealing with politics and, you know, rivalries and such. The next thing I read was a middle grade novel, and that is Carmer and Grit Book 1, The Wing Snatchers. This is a debut, and it's the first in a series. There will be at least one more book. I don't know how many there are going to be, but this is the only one that's out so far. This is a steampunkish fantasy novel that involves a boy named Carmer, who is the apprentice of a stage magician, and a fairy princess named Grit. I really liked the steampunk and fantasy world of this. I thought some of the descriptive writing was really imaginative. There were some things that I feel so-so about. I am going to do a full review of this when I have another middle grade book to pair it with in a review. So I do have some more complex, in-depth thoughts, but I'm saving them for later. I gave this 4 stars when I finished it. I'm thinking in retrospect that when I do my review, I may downgrade it to 3. I thought that Grit was a kind of underdeveloped character. I was afraid that since she's like this little Tinkerbell type fairy, that there was not going to be like any real fae folklore in this, but there is. It's just like tamed down a little bit for kids. So yeah, review to come. This is one where I'm not itching to get my hands on the sequel, but I am likely to be interested enough to read it to see if this series improves. This was an enjoyable middle grade read for me. And then the last thing I read was the other of the two graphic novels that I mentioned earlier, and this is The Tea Dragon Society by Katie O'Neill, which I absolutely loved. I gave it 5 stars. This is also ostensibly for kids, but I recommend it for everyone. It's just such a charming and whimsical book, and it's one of those just utterly heartwarming things that's just unabashedly cute. I love how this used like traditional high fantasy world building elements but made it just like sweet and charming and wholesome. The main character is Greta, who's this girl here. Her mother is a blacksmith, but no one really uses swords for anything anymore. They're just works of beauty and artisanship. She's learning blacksmithing from her mother, but one day she also stumbles across a little tea dragon, what turns out to be a tea dragon, that's being attacked by these dogs, and she saves it and takes it home. And just one of the early examples of how charming this book is that when she does this, she's like, oh, these dogs, they're just hungry, and she feeds them. Like, we're just warm and fuzzy towards everyone in this book. She returns the tea dragon to its owner, who is a tea shop owner. The tea shop owner and his partner, who is this guy in the wheelchair, take care of these little tea dragons. They are what remains of the Tea Dragon Society, looking after the art and craft of tea dragon care, because they're these domesticated dragons that grow magical tea leaves out of their heads and are entirely dependent on the loving care of their owners and form deep bonds with them. These two are also looking out for Min, this girl here. She's dealing with some sort of mental health issues having to do with her memory after a traumatic magical incident. It's incredibly inclusive, and it is so short, but I wanted more, and most of all, I wanted a tea dragon. I want a tea dragon so much now. This is a new favorite graphic novel for me. I gave it 5 stars. It's absolutely lovely. Anywho, I finally got to the end of what I read in January. Watch out for my February wrap-up. Who the heck knows when? Anyhow, let me know if you've read any of these or if you're planning to. I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.